Hey, hello. Can you hear me well? So first of all, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I'm going to speak a bit about microservices, and I would like to ask you, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you read that word? So probably you think about technology, right? You think about the frameworks. You think about how to deploy the stuff you build. There's a lot. Databases, is it the right choice? So you tend to lose most of your time and initial energy thinking about this. And what I want to speak and kind of to talk to you about today is what is beyond this. I want to speak about what underlies, after the choices in tech that we do in the long-lasting part of operating microservices, which in my point of view are teams, people. People, they do matter a lot more than the technology you choose. In the end, they will be responsible for implementing that technology, and they will deliver features, products, added value, people. So a bit about me. My name is Paulo. I'm the engineering director at Onfido here in Lisbon. I've authored a while back a cookbook on Elixir, a language that I still love after all these years. And I'm also a co-author of the Microservices in Action along with the VP Engineering of Onfido 2, Morgan. So you will find my handles over there. The emojis didn't go that well, I think. But again, it's my Slack handle on PixelsCamp. Also my GitHub user, and good luck with the Twitter handle. If you need to kind of reach out to me, it's probably best to use the Slack. So from context, I work at Onfido, and a lot of what I'm going to kind of present today is related to the latest experience I had, which is an experience that lasts for the past 4.5 years. So what we do now, we are creating an open world where identity is key to access. So we provide services for people to be able to access online services remotely and with security. And this was not what we always did. So we pivoted a lot in the course of these 4 years. So our evolution, I could kind of sum it up in a kind of a brief instant. We started in 2014 when I joined. Well, we didn't. I started at 2014. Our product was mostly an MVP that was focusing a lot on background checking. And the team evolved dramatically. I was probably the 7th or 8th engineer joining. Nowadays, we're probably 70 engineers around research and all of the other facets of software development. We are heavily distributed, no longer just a small team in London. We have people spread across the world, but in engineering, on the engineering side, we have people in Lisbon and in London. We have been product-oriented team since 2015, when we did like mid 2015, where we did our initial attempt to kind of migrate from that pool of engineers that would do whatever feature that was needed from the same code base to something that could help us kind of scale and focus a lot more on deliver features and the products that we devised, and that also allowed us to experiment, to change, to move fast, hopefully not breaking too much. So, question maybe for you. How many of you are in teams that are over 10, 15 engineers? Okay, a few. So the purpose of this talk is probably, well, as I mentioned, like microservices and people operating those microservices. Probably below that 10, 15 mark, it's probably an overkill. But if you scale and if you start kind of growing your teams, you need to think about how to organize them. What will be your plan for growth in the next couple of years? And how would you be able to give those teams the autonomy, the ability to experiment, and cause the least friction possible to deliver at pace? So I'm not sure if you are familiar with Conway's law. Melvin Conway in 1967 devised this law. He states that any organization that designs a system tends to design that system as a copy of the communication structures that are underlying. So the challenge that we faced was to understand if we could, by any means, change the structure, doing the opposite. So by changing the way we operate, we kind of change the communication structure of a whole company. So building effective teams. As I mentioned, if you start scaling and moving beyond a small group of people, it's going to be always a fine balance between autonomy and collaboration. And at a given point, you almost start treating your teams as individuals. So it's like you start growing and growing and growing, and that presents a lot of challenges. What all of this scaling has to do with microservices. So they are really a great tool to get things done in a fast and independent way. I think we are at the point, like past 2017, 2018, where we're already discussing if we should go back to the monolith. So I think the hype has already cooled down, which is kind of good. I think we can now focus on microservices as being just another tool in our tool set that can help us to actually scale our teams. Not just making microservices for the sake of it, but actually treating this as a form of enabling collaboration, experimentation, and independence. How many of you deploy a huge code base or have dependencies between teams and need to synchronize a lot? Okay, so microservices will allow you on specific portions of your product that can be sliced to actually do those changes independently and with less friction. But they're not a silver bullet. As with anything, it comes with a price to pay. And the price is additional complexity on the day-to-day operations. So security on call, like monitoring, logging, knowing what's going on, everything becomes a bit more complex than with your monolith. And this also, and this is the thing that I want to stress out, it demands a culture of ownership and accountability. And I think to reach to that stage where you have ownership and accountability, you need to do it with a smaller group of people that know exactly what they own, and they are responsible for what they do and what they develop and deploy. So why are people so important and teams are so important in this movement? Because they will own those services. They will be accountable for those services. They will be accountable for those features and that added value that you bring to the table. And a long-running system is it isn't just an accumulation of features and things like technology that you bring in. They reflect the preferences and the objectives of that group of people. So in order to set up your teams and start scaling, one of the first questions would be, what would be the ideal team size? Well, I would say that depends a lot on what stage you are and what kind of company you are. But there are two rules of thumb. One of them is Jeff Bezos, 2 pizza teams, which means that if you have 2 family pizzas, big ones, and you can feed a whole team, then probably the team is the right size. This unfortunately has a caveat. It does not work for us at Onfido because we have 2 people that could easily smash those 2 pizzas, and it's probably too small of a team. There's also Michael Lop's 7 plus or minus 3, which means you can get to 4 to 10 people. And when I mention the 7, the 4 or 10 people, I mean not only engineers. We'll get into that in a bit, but just to clear this out, I'm not talking about engineering teams. I'm talking about product teams. Teams that are comprised by QA, software engineers, designers, product owners, researchers. So broad product teams. So again, relating back to the previous slides, what is the impact of the size in communication inside a team. Imagine this. Look next to your sides and imagine that you're just 3 of you. How many communication lines do you have? You just have 3 communication lines, and you get things quite easily across the board. But if you are 5, have you imagined how many connections you have? You have 10 communication lines. And if you are 7, that number increases to 21 communication lines. So this is also something to keep in mind, depending on the task that team has at hand, to make sure that you take this increased communication overhead into account. It's not adding people. This has an impact in being able to communicate what you intend to do. It becomes harder the bigger the team gets. Hence, quite commonly, when you get to a certain size, you probably try to identify other portions of the product to split that team further down. One thing to keep in mind also is that small teams, they move way faster. Less communication lines, right? They move way faster and they gel together quite quickly. So just keep in mind of not throwing people into the problem, because it will have an overhead that has to be accounted for. So we've covered team sizes. Now, what types of teams can we have? We can have infrastructure. And this is not necessarily like the product teams that I've mentioned before. I'm contradicting myself. I do that every time. Platform teams, and we have product teams. The 3 of them are actually needed. Infrastructure, think about security, networking, storage, normally operations. Think about platform teams as being the ones that enable deployments, that deal with the tooling, they deal with monitoring, with the templates or the chassis that you use at your company to keep uniform microservices. They are enablers. Then you have product teams, which, as I mentioned, can be comprised of QA, products, back-end engineers, front-end engineers, researchers, etc. Think about like a sequence that the infrastructure team enables the platform team, and the platform team enables the product teams. So this is also something to keep in mind, because if you grow up to a certain size, you will need these 3 teams kind of in place. Sometimes one of them can kind of do a bit of the platform team can do a bit of the infrastructure role, but at a given size, that thing won't scale, and you need these 3 types of teams. Now, when we have those teams, how do we group them together? Well, we can group teams by function. So you have all of your backend developers, all of your front-end developers, all of your QA engineers, all of the product people, and they kind of form small silos where that's what you call a team. And then what you do is you pick a team member for a given project. This is as an approach that's probably common to some of you, especially if you're doing consultancy, etc. I would like to focus on product teams, and for product teams, this is a really bad idea. Again, my opinion, but I'll stick to it. It's a really bad idea, because you will get, even though that the communication circuits between those team members are quite easy, and that knowledge, the best practices of front-end or of back-end are passed along within that boundary, things do get complex because you don't have a clear ownership. The project ends, everyone disbands, and who's going to own that thing that's running for longer than the life cycle of that particular squad that was assembled. So there's unclear ownership, there is lack of autonomy, there's no long-term responsibility, and you get kind of this risk of silos. So the knowledge, like the front-end knowledge, gets quite siloed into that front-end team, the back-end knowledge on the back-end team, and so forth. So again, as I mentioned before, if you want to operate microservices successfully, you need accountability and ownership. This does not mean that these teams don't have a place. For instance, your ops team will probably, to deal with infrastructure, won't have to have front-end engineers. But you can probably treat it as a product team, because it's also a product that's used within your company. We tend to think about clients as something that lives on the outside world, something that our sales people and our product owners deal with on a daily basis. No, if you're working together, the person that sits next to you is your client. You will probably provide him some functionality, some service. So think about yourselves as clients of each other, even inside an organization. So to some extent, this ops team with some sort of product or oriented mind can also have some benefits. So for product teams, my preferred takeaway is to group them by across functions. You pick a back-end developer, or 2 or 3, whatever, front-end developers, you pick a product owner. If you're doing machine learning, you probably also embed that research team within one single team. And you bring in all of these different specialists to achieve a business goal, to be very market-driven, and to have a long-term mission. This long-term mission aligns with business and promotes ownership. Again, I'm stressing this over and over again. If you want to operate a microservices architecture successfully, ownership is paramount. Then, how do you set team boundaries? So even though you have selected people from multiple functions and group them together as a team, you still need to set some boundaries. A cross-functional team needs to have a mission. That mission serves as an inspiration and at the same time becomes the boundary. The mission is usually a business problem that team was assembled to solve, and that team also owns. It's completely owning its roadmap, and so I've mentioned about the size. Imagine this: you have I don't know, you have online e-commerce platform. So you have the shopping cart, you have the payments, you have the onboarding of clients, etc. Imagine that you get so big and so specialized that that shopping cart team can be broken into different geographies or different features. So you can still, on this, on this vertical slice, you can split further down. Imagine it got like to the 20 people you need. You can then specialize and specialize inside this slice. What happened to us? We kept these lines and these boundaries quite strict, but often, if needed, we can change the scope of a team. We can move people around. We can so this don't get this as being something very strict, something very rigid that you need to maintain. But in essence, align teams with business responsibility. So I've mentioned the grouping teams by function. That kind of, it's quite nice to spread knowledge. All of the front-enders will be up to with the latest framework that was out. The back-enders will know all about the best new shiny language, framework, etc. How do you think that impacts by having like multiple people from different functions in a team? How do you think that impacts the way you produce software and the practices? What are the caveats for having this? Well, one of that caveat is you probably reinvent the wheel. You probably solve the same problem in like different ways across different teams. And to be honest, that's not necessarily bad. We can try to be more effective by increasing the communication between teams and spreading that knowledge, but don't worry too much if you're reinventing the wheel or solving the same problem in different ways, because that's a price to pay with autonomy and the speed that you get. Less synchronization, more speed. Just try to keep things in a balance. It's always like a fine and delicate balance. But don't worry too much if this is happening. Otherwise, you risk having this like a bounded team, but then with all of the pitfalls of having to synchronize multiple times and understand what's going on other areas of their speciality. So sharing knowledge. Also, one of the key things to minimize that problem of solving or reinventing the wheel or solving the same problem in different ways. You can increase the pace. You can have multiple people solving in different problems multiple times in a different way. And you probably have these specialists having a less engagement. It's very common for you to have 3, 4, or 5 back-end engineers and then 1 or 2 front-end engineers or UI UX, depending on the product. Or if it's very front-end oriented, 1 back-end engineer and 5 front-end engineers. What happens is these front-end engineers, they tend to be more up to date with what's going on because they kind of have multiple inputs, multiple experiences, and they can kind of create some sort of common ground for their knowledge. So they kind of become less engaged with that function. Also the other thing that can happen is these team members will make decisions based upon their local view of the problem. And sometimes there are, I would say, there are better ways to solve that problem, widespread, and maybe someone in the company already found out about that. And this can be kind of lost. So what do you do to break this silo and promote knowledge across those functions? Their Spotify model, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, they defend, they kind of use guilds and chapters. And the concept of, for instance, a chapter is you group people by a functional speciality. So they are part of that bounded team. They have their product orientation, but then they get together into chapters where they discuss things like mobile development, front end, language X, Y, or Z that's used in your company, and they get this place where they can actually share and understand the best practices or set those best practices. And then you can also have guilds, which are even more specialized, and it's not like a grouping by function. It has to do, for instance, performance. You can have a front-end developer and a back-end developer getting together into a guild where they really want to know more about performance and security, whatever. There's, I think, also another concept called tribes, where you actually go for a particular topic. I think it's quite similar to chapters, where people go around, for instance, React or Elixir or F#, something like that. So there's also another way to promote knowledge, which is keeping your teams, like your team dynamics and the movements within teams dynamic. Yes, it's good to have long-term ownership. Yes, it's good to have the knowledge being kind of accumulated within the team. So if you have a member for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you will have a lot of context. But do keep in mind that it's also good to sometimes, allow, it's not forced, but allow people to move across teams. And this knowledge sharing will happen almost organically. And also, you will probably be keeping people a lot happier, which is also a great thing if you want to kind of retain them in your company. So, one thing that also, so this is sharing the knowledge within your organization. There's also one thing that you need to keep in mind is documentation, and I initially started on the Ruby world, and documentation is something that you use probably the specs and you don't care too much. I don't mean code comments, okay? I mean documentation of the features and the things that the services that you are owning provide. Also run books, so that people that need to operate your services instantly know how to do it, at least the frequent operations. Doing this, you kind of share knowledge outside your teams, but you also promote the discussion within the team. It's very important for you to keep this in mind. It also, documentation can be, for instance, tech updates. What have you done in the previous sprint? What have you done in the previous quarter? How often do we, as like product teams, have the time to actually sit down and talk to our peers and present to our peers, which we assume that know everything that we're doing, because obviously we're engineers, like it can't be rocket science, right? So it's important to take that time, and documentation also helps to kind of organically share and avoid, gain more efficiency, because we avoid that kind of silo and that repetition of the same solution. Just make yourself aware as a team. Let your peers that are sitting probably next to you know what are you doing and how you solve the problem. Discussions will arise, and discussions are great to promote change and improvement. So just be aware, be within your context, be within your boundaries, but do step out of that sometimes, because it's really valuable in the long run. Historically, one other thing I want to mention is, historically on the development, software development process, we would have those guys over there in the, well, we're in the basement, they're probably beneath the basement doing ops, right? So what we do, we pack features, we build features, they are amazing, we just throw them over the fence and deploy them. It's not my problem anymore, right? Done. I've met all of my acceptance criteria, everything is fine, not my problem anymore, let ops deal with that. Please, please, please don't fall into this pitfall. This trap is really, really hard to get out of. You need to make sure that your teams, they embrace the DevOps culture, and you are responsible as a team to operate the features that you build. Again, you don't need to build the infrastructure. There's an infrastructure team to do that. But the responsibility of operating, of deploying, on keeping an eye of if that feature or the product that you deployed meets the requirements and it's operating within the correct levels of service that you expect, the responsibility is yours. It's not someone else's problem. We keep going back and back to this: ownership and accountability. So just don't throw things over the fence. This will help you break a lot of barriers between the build and the run of the building and the running of software. And just also keep in mind that probably the time you took, especially if you went for microservices, it can make like in a week or something, the time you spent designing and actually implementing something is way, way, way less than the time that thing will be spent running in production. So make sure it's yours, that you own it, and that you take good care and responsibility for it. This also means when shit hits the fan, you are also responsible for dealing with that. This does not mean that everyone at the company needs to be on call at all times. You should have probably someone from the platform, someone from the infrastructure teams, and someone from the product teams being aware that they may be woken up if something goes wrong, but you need to set an escalation policy for that. Maybe you can have 2 or 3 people on a rota that will be the first responders, and then if they are not able to solve the problem, they will escalate that to the proper product team. So now you see the importance of having documentation and run books in place. It can save you from being woken up at 3 a.m. And one of the other things I would like to mention around on-call is that we tend to think that this is some sort of grunt work, some sort of penalty. It's not fun. It's not ever going to be fun being woken up at 3 a.m. to diagnose something. You have no idea of like what's the cause of the problem. But it's something that needs to be done by everyone at the company. In our example, for instance, I'm on call, the VP engineering is on call, the CTO is on call, anyone can be on the on-call rota. It's not, there's not some sort of hierarchy and people getting, spared from that trouble. This also gives us ways of identifying problems, recurring problems, of reassessing and reevaluating all of the monitors that are in place, allows us to understand what needs to be changed, what needs to be improved, and it's not necessarily the the two people that kind of build that particular part that's more troublesome, that, they keep on patching it, it's just their problem. This also promotes like a bigger awareness of what's going on. As I said, inclusive, all of the people from the company, there's no ranking on this. It also needs to be fair. It's not business as usual. It's an effort, it's an extra effort, so you need to be compensated for that effort. You need to be properly paid to actually be on an on-call duty. It needs to be sustainable. You don't want those 4 team members doing all of the rota, because like 2 people on call each week, primary and secondary, you would see like week in, week out, it won't work. You will burn out. So if you don't get to the scale where you can actually afford, not just in terms of money, but in terms of size, to afford to have multiple people on call, then think twice. Think about a different solution, but probably you also won't have the same number of problems. Sorry, I meant occurrences of like issues that actually need to be addressed. One key thing to keep in mind, and this is where the on-call people bring things into the teams within their boundaries, this also needs to be reflective. We need to understand what went wrong, how to fix it, and how to prevent this from happening again. So, it was quite short. I just want to, I think I'm going to share with you like a parting thought, and then talk a bit about our experience. One thing, you remember that slide about Conway's Law, right? What if the way we build, the way we group ourselves together to build and to design software could actually change fundamentally the way our company operates? At this point, I'm not 100% sure that our successful migration along these years to a microservice architecture was, just luck. If we got successful to this point because we adopted microservices, were the structures in place that kind of allowed us to organically adopt that? I think there was an effort. I think there was experimentation. As I told you, in 2015, we decided to go from this monolith where we already had some sort of ownership, like components of that monolith already had teams assigned or people that were specialists on that area. So we decided to move further and start splitting things apart so that we could be owning things and break out of the release cycles, and be able to kind of be faster. But it fundamentally also changed the way our engineering culture kind of emerged. So I think, honestly think, it is possible to change to change our company and our organization by changing the way we actually address this way of developing and releasing products. So yeah, it was quick. Questions? I would be happy to also open some space for you to ask me about our process and our change, anything related to like operation, not just necessarily about people, but yeah, happy to. I also noticed that due to the time I probably spoke too fast, so if this is available on streaming, try to play this at like half speed. And I was mindful. Any questions? Oh, early lunch then? Done. Thank you.